All right. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, 11/11 today. Pretty cool. Welcome back to the stream here. We've got a 3-game NBA slate tonight here. We've got a 10-game NHL slate, I think, going on here. And, of course, Thursday night football. So plenty of DFS stuff to talk about. We'll go ahead and start jumping into questions here shortly. We have a few questions in the queue here today. As always, feel free to pop your questions into either YouTube chat or into the Office Hours channel on Slack. I try to tackle these as best I can in chronological order. So if you've got something you've been wanting to ask, go ahead and fire it off here into those two channels. If you haven't joined our Slack community yet, there's a link to join in the description of every past Office Hours video. Highly recommend joining up. You get the opportunity to throw these questions into Slack. A lot of the first questions I answer every single day are from Slack, but of course you get access to the very valuable sim alerts channels. Definitely a lot of questions always about seeing when individual game sims are running, seeing if we have ran a new sim for when a piece of news comes out or anything like that. You can see all that very easily, especially in a sport where it really matters like NBA in these sim alerts channels. So if you watch these regularly, or even if it's your first time watching here today, join up into Slack. Check out that link to join in the description of any past Office Hours video. We'll go ahead and just start jumping into questions here today. Let me go ahead and get the app pulled up. Not a big fan of these. I've got NHL pulled up here. Not the biggest fan of these 3-game NBA slates. I think these are a little tricky to play. People kind of fall into some of the best plays a little too often for my comfort. Definitely would prefer a more balanced schedule of NBA games rather than the 3-game Tuesday, the 13-game Wednesday, and the 3-game Thursday. But you take what you can get. Of course, we have the NFL showdown tonight here too anyway. So let me go ahead. We'll start here. This question came in just after, about an hour after I hopped off stream yesterday. And this question says, this is from Andrew in Slack, and he said the max viewable lineups is 1,500 in the app. When you say you run thousands of sims of a game, do you run 1,500 or more? If more, then why are we only able to see 1,500? My bottom line is if there are a pool of sims that lineups are extracted from, and there are only 1,500 sims, and 50 users ran a research build, in theory, they would all see the same exposures. If there's more than 1,500, then now SaberSim is introducing variance by not allowing all the sims in the pool to be accounted. Is this to avoid duplicate lineups for its users? So we do run, I would say for the average game, it is definitely more than 1,500 sims we are running for each individual game. I think it's probably closer to 5,000 or 10,000, but that is for every individual game. So if you're thinking about a research build here, right? Running builds 0-0-10, right? Yes, so you are going to be capped. Let me put it this way. So if you run your research build, right? And you build 1,500 lineups with 15 different kind of slate simulations, right? Those are slate simulations, individual game sims of every game. We can't possibly give you a research build that would give you every single individual combination of every game, right? And even for a slate like tonight, that would be, say we run 5,000 game simulations of each of these games, that would be 5,000 to the third power possible different combinations of sims that you could see here. So that's basically kind of the reason why this is limited at 1,500 to prevent somebody from building 20,000 lineups anyway, or something like that. But the reason why on like a research build, why you only see the 1,500 is because we can't possibly actually show every single individual combination of a game sim. So the sims themselves, though, are in the thousands, 5,000 to 10,000 or so per game. So I think maybe there is a little bit of confusion here in the question too, of like the difference between a game simulation that we have, right? A game simulation of this game versus a lineup that we have built versus a slate simulation in the form of a research build, right? So when we've simulated every game however many times, let's just use the 5,000 number, right? And then you build your lineups. So let's just talk about a normal build, right? So we're just talking about totally normal build. You build your 20 lineups, right? So you're actually building 500 here. We're going to bucket the game simulations here with sim variance of 7, take small buckets of game simulations, and build the best possible lineup we can 500 times for each individual lineup, right? So we're taking groups of those sims and building lineups for them. When we run the research build, right, we're basically taking advantage of a particular setting that can be used to roughly simulate the slate 1,500 times, but it by no means takes into account every single possible outcome or every single possible combination of sims, because the number of those possible sims are enormous, even on a 3-game NBA slate. So the natural variance you get, the question here, is this in order to avoid duplicated lineups for its users? Not necessarily, but that is an effect you get out of it, because the way that your sims are going to be bucketed every single time you build a lineup will be different than every other person that's going to be building lineups, and you have all these different combinations and things like that. A nice positive effect of that is that it's quite a bit harder to duplicate another SaberSim user than it is compared to any other traditional tool. So hopefully that kind of gets at your question here. But yeah, definitely a good question. And I think from the practical standpoint, right, on the research build side of things, that is kind of a known limitation of the research build. So I've mentioned here before, when you run this build, if you run these builds at 0, 0, 10, and you're simulating the slate out 1,500 times, there's going to be variance every single time you do that in what the actual exposures you get to each player are based on what sims you get in that build. Which is why I say to use it more as kind of a guideline, as a helpful tool, but not like a law or something written in stone, because those exposures have natural variance, just given based on the fact that of, you know, all of the possible combinations of slate sims that you could get here, right? What is that? I'm actually curious. Let's say it's 5,000 games to the third power times 5,000, right? Oh God, what is that? 125 billion combinations, right? That's too many. So 1,500 is very small compared to that number, but it is still a lot of different sims. Still is a lot of different ways that the slate could play out. It's still a useful tool. So, but anyway, Sheets said, don't hate on NHL. I would say NHL is the sport where SaberSim gives me the most edge of all. The lineups are low-owned correlating machines. Basically lineups I would never get to ever with default slider settings. Yeah, no, I completely get that. I'm just really diving into my NHL DFS career here now, with the support of Mr. Clean and Couch, who taught me what I'm supposed to be doing here last week on that strategy session. So no, I'm a little excited to play this 11-game slate. I think I've just got a single bullet in it. I am a little bummed that DraftKings posted that $4.20 max that had like 45,000 entrants, and got my hopes up that there might be actually like a big, good-looking GPP at like somewhat lower stakes to play today before they took it down. The writing was on the wall when they titled that contest Opening Day Special or whatever. That clearly was a mistake. But I saw that last night and I was like, oh, slow NBA night, only a 3-game NBA slate. Maybe DraftKings has taken a shot on a big NHL GPP that maybe they're trying to promote or something. I have no idea, but should have known. Opening Day Special was not a good sign. And of course, they are not going to compete with Thursday Night Football if they're going to take a shot on a big NHL contest like that. But yeah. Cool. Let's go ahead. Let's keep it rolling here. Jump into the next question. Talk about this one real quick. I answered this in Slack just because it was asked close to lock, and I thought it was probably going to be helpful for last night. But always like to just review these here on stream. So this was from Steve. He said, question about late swap. Do I need to download a new CSV file and upload it after players lock? Or will the site know if players have already locked into my lineups? For example, in NBA, do I need to download a new CSV after the 7 o'clock games lock, then the 7:30, then the 8, and so on? You don't need to re-download your CSV every single time. As long as you are refreshing your screen, right? Like the only thing that I think can happen, and we're actually planning on fixing this just so you don't even have to worry about that at all. But let me load my entries for tonight here real quick. So if you get your entries in, right? So you put your entries in, you build your lineups, you put everything in at lock. And if you just leave the screen here and literally do not touch it and then go sit down on the couch to go watch basketball or hockey, whatever it is going to be, right? And then you come back in later and immediately just click late swap, that is a situation where it may not recognize that players have locked. All you need to do is just go in and click this little refresh thing and it'll refresh and then you're good to go. But otherwise, you know, if you navigate away from this page and come back, you can see this thing will automatically always spin anytime you move around the app. That is why we do that, so that you always have the most up-to-date information. We keep track of this for you. So if you ever run into trouble, though, and you run a late swap, you get an error uploading it, and you're like, what's going on? Just reset then at that point by clicking Upload New Entries, re-download your file from DraftKings and re-upload it, and it will just reset everything, get everything back in sync, and you'll be good to go from there. So, but good question there. Okay, next question I had here. This is from Steven, and I don't think I'm going to be able to answer this question in a very satisfying way, unfortunately, because I haven't built the thing, but we'll read it. So Stephen said, I was wondering from a programming perspective, and that's where I'm going to be limited, how SaberSim's correlation and ownership fade sliders work. I feel like most optimizers are linear or integer programming problems, but whenever I've done DFS in the past, incorporating interplayer correlations makes the problem way more complicated and take up a lot more computing time / power. So Steve, I'm going to answer this question from a more practical standpoint of what is actually kind of happening here in your lineups and how we're calculating these things there. I don't know how the thing's built. I've already kind of reached out for some backup here to answer this question more from a programming standpoint to satisfy your curiosity here, but I don't really know the answer to that. I will say this, and hopefully this answer is not too overly simplified for what you're actually looking for here. But the correlation values between player are literally coefficients of correlation between two players' fantasy point production across the full run of the thousands of game sims that we have for a player. So that is how those are calculated, right? The ownership, and I know your questions are more about how the sliders are actually working, but just real quick to preface this, the ownership projections are generated by building thousands of lineups at very high variance settings using an aggregate projection from around the industry of what we think the field is going to think that the mean projections are for players, and then those players' exposures in those high variance builds become their ownership projections. Now, from there, again, answering this much more on a practical level than exactly on maybe how the algorithm is written, right? The lineups are constructed player by player. So what will happen is the very first thing that happens here is sim variance is kind of the first to act in theory here. Is the higher this is, the smaller a bucket of random game simulations we'll use to collect and use as those players' projections for that individual lineup. So at 9, it's going to be a pretty small bucket of game sims, and we'll take an aggregate projection of what those players scored in the game sims for that particular lineup. Then each player has a multiplier applied to them based on the ownership fade slider. So depending on how wide that player's range of outcomes are, how variant that player is, and also how that player's ownership projection compares to the average ownership projection at the position, they will have a multiplier to their projected point value that values players that have lower ownership more and devalues players that have higher ownership more, right? So once that's done, then a player will be entered into the lineup. Maybe it's the highest overall scoring times ownership multiplier player in the pool. And then in this particular case, correlation's off. So presumably the next player will just be added into the lineup. Obviously, other things come into play here, like stacking rules and player exposure requirements and things like that, but this is a simplified version. The next player will be entered into the lineup. If the correlation value is non-zero, then the correlation values between players start to come into play and further create multipliers on the player's projection ownership combination number based on how correlated the next player is to the other players already in the lineup. So that's my understanding of how it works on a practical level of how the lineup is constructed. It's player by player, right? With those factors kind of impacting the number, the projection essentially. And then on step 3, all of those lineups that were created are essentially graded by SaberScore. So SaberScore is essentially a tool that SaberSim uses to grade itself. So it takes 500 or 1,500 shots at building the best lineup, and then using a different algorithm for SaberScore grades its lineups and says, okay, these are the best lineups that I did, thinking about correlation, ownership, and raw upside together. But I don't know how the code's written to do the whole thing, so I can't really speak to what the actual algorithms look like or anything like that there. So, but hopefully that was helpful, at least as a little bit of kind of a practical background of what's going on behind the scenes. So there was a follow-up question here. And Steven said, let's see, let's get this in here. I like to do a bit of modeling on the side and compare against SaberSim results. Is there a way to export a correlation matrix for players? There is not. And frankly, there won't ever be. That information is really valuable. We want our users to have access to all of the correlations between players in the app. And we want you guys to be able to take advantage of using this valuable data when you're building lineups, right? That is literally what happens when you build lineups for high correlation sports like NFL. But that is not something we want ever floating around out there, because we strongly believe that that is really, really powerful and important DFS data. So unfortunately, no downloadable correlation matrices or anything like that for our data. But cool. I'm going to go ahead and we'll jump to this next question. This is from Jared here, and he said, can you explain what you consider a small contest? Some people think a contest is small just because it's a single or 3 entry, when in reality it's a small entry. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's kind of semantical. I don't know. I would probably, it depends on the sport too, right? 1,000 people entry contest in NFL is going to be pretty small. In NHL, it maybe isn't that small, right? Pretty decent sized contest. I think what's more important than thinking about what's the definition or the semantics of what you're calling a small contest, I think it's more important how you're playing that contest, right? What do we actually want to do from a strategic standpoint? What do we want to do differently from a strategic standpoint when we're playing a 1,000 person contest compared to a 50,000 person contest, right? And that's one of the things that I think SaberSim does really well. And honestly, I think it's just something that is virtually ignored by other tools out there, is how differently you want to play, even keeping entry limit contests, but how even keeping entry limit constant, how differently you should be playing a contest with 1,000 entrants versus a contest with 50,000 entrants. Right. So I think that's probably the more important lesson here, is what do we do differently in contests of different sizes, rather than what do we personally define as a small or a medium or a large sized contest. So, but if there is a follow up there or something that you've got kind of that you're thinking about, this every once in a while I read a question here on stream that I get the sense I'm like, this person's definitely got something that they're thinking about up here. That is the next question that is meant to be asked. So if you've got something there, feel free to fire it off. But all right, cool. Let's get to Sheets' question here. When you do allocate custom exposure settings, how does the optimizer prioritize exposure over viability? That is, if you want 80% of 14 guys, it won't let that happen. But how does it prioritize between a user's desired exposures, viability, overall projection of that lineup, etc.? That's a good question. So, I mean, it is a little bit different here, whether you're talking about lineups pre or post build. So let me go ahead and let's do a very quick build here of some lineups, right? Because you can set exposures before and after your build. So let's say we're building for the hypothetical 20 max 50K contest here, right? So post build, the lineups already exist. The lineups have already been created. And when we set exposures for different players, we are going to basically just resort the lineups and try to maximize the total Saber score or the total projected score, depending on your sorting method, that we can, giving you the best possible pool of 20 lineups that match all of your exposures. And it's sorting through lineups that have already been created. So these lineups, I guess at this point, put another way, the lineups here that we're building are agnostic to what our exposures are going to be here, right? Doesn't know what the exposures are ahead of time. Sheet said, right, I meant pre-build, I guess. Yeah, cool. We'll wrap around to pre-build. I'll just go ahead and explain the rest of this here for anybody else watching here, right? But just in case, for those of you that maybe don't already know this, right? Like what's actually happening here if we go in and set a 50% max exposure for Dearness Johnson, and then we set a 60% min exposure for Keenan Allen, and so on, right? What we're doing here is sorting through this pool of 500 lineups and finding the 20 that maximize Saber score across the entire pool that fit all of these exposures. But you can set these pre-build as well here, right? And what's going to happen pre-build is that we're going to make sure that these exposures are maintained throughout the entire pool ahead of time. And what's going to happen now, the builder will have some knowledge that this is like intended beforehand. So it will make sure that these exposures are met progressively throughout the build. And I think, again, this is a question here where I may need to go back to Matt to figure out like precisely how this is happening. But from what I understand is going on here is, for example, if we set a Josh Allen lineup, well, let's talk about it like this here first. So if we lock Josh Allen, right, what happens is going to be very obvious. He's going to be the first player that goes into every single lineup. He's going to just be entered into the lineup, and then we'll build the best possible lineup around that player based on the sim variance and the ownership and the correlation of other players into the lineup for every single lineup, right? If we do a minimum exposure to 80%, what I believe happens, right, this is how I understand how the lineups are built, is that we will check if the exposure for that particular player is met at the start of building a lineup, right? So let's say if you're building the first lineup in the pool, right, 0% of the lineups then have Josh Allen. So Josh Allen will go into that lineup, then we'll build the best possible lineup around it, right? Then the next lineup that gets built, at that moment, the entire pool of lineups have 100% Josh Allen exposure. So that lineup does not necessarily need to include Josh Allen in it, right? So we build just a lineup. Then the next lineup, there's 2 lineups have been created, and we have 50% total exposure to Josh Allen. The 80% minimum exposure to Josh Allen is not met in the pool, so Josh Allen gets entered into that lineup. Then we build the best lineup around it. That is how I understand that these are built. That is my understanding. I'm not positive that is the exact way it is done. I will follow up on that, but that is how I understand it is built. So, I mean, thinking about this from the standpoint of like viability, right? We are honoring exposures that are entered here into step 1, but that is still like a human touch here that's entering into the system that might affect the viability of a lineup, right? Like the viability of your entire pool, right? You are saying, I want 80% Josh Allen no matter what, and kind of overriding. Well, we'll still build the best possible lineup around it in those lineups that include Josh Allen. You're kind of making a statement that the most viable way to play the slate is to have 80% Josh Allen from there. So it's riskier, I guess. It's changing the system. It's in some ways kind of stripping SaberSim of the ability to make the 1,500 most viable lineups that it thinks it would, and saying that these are some restrictions that need to be put on this process. So that is, make sure here. Yeah, cool. See and make sure, didn't have any questions here coming in. That is my understanding of how this works. And it is also why a ton of exposure limitations on step 1 can take a little bit longer for the builder to make, because it's kind of processing those things, right? But Sheets, let me know if you have any other follow-up questions on that. But it's a good question. So it is another reason why I prefer to do things in step 3 when I can get away with it, right? If you have a very opinionated stance on a lot of different min and max exposures, to get your pool of lineups the way you want them, you may need to enter them into step 1. But what is really nice about editing in step 3, and maybe this is just my a little bit of my use case bias here, but is if you go in and do it here instead and say I want 80% Josh Allen, right? You can kind of you're selecting lineups that were created agnostically from this. So you're saying make the best 500 lineups you can for the slate, and then give me the best lineups that have 80% Josh Allen. And I don't know, that's always just sat a little bit better with me personally. But I don't know if that actually is necessarily better. So, but anyway, let's go ahead. We'll tackle the next question here. This is from Cleansinger. Question about, oh, actually, real quick, let me go ahead and hit this. This is a follow-up from Sheets. If you set 9 wide receivers at 80% each, you won't be able to get 80% of them all. Will SaberSim give you less of each or give you 80% of 1 or 2 guys? Will it base those decisions on the projected scores? Oh, man, that's a good question. I don't know. Let me test that out. Let's see. I'm curious what it will just do. Let's see. So if we just demand something that the builder can't meet. So it can't satisfy all of this, right? We can't have 80% exposure to all of these guys. Let's see. I am curious how it will prioritize this. But what I assume it's going to do is do what I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, she said drum roll. Yeah, let's see. I mean, I don't even know necessarily what we're going to get out of this. I do believe that the builder is set to complete and we can kind of see it here. I do believe that we have this set to at least complete the build, but it's going to give us a message saying we couldn't meet all of the exposures. From there, I'm not really sure how it decides how to break ties, to be completely honest. I guess we will see. Maybe it tries to maintain 80% exposure to some of the players. Maybe it spreads it out. Okay, so yeah, obviously we can't meet that. So here's what I think is happening based on the fact that I'm seeing 30%, 30%, 30%, 30%, 30%, is that it is essentially doing what I was describing before, right? So it's going through and it's building a lineup, and it's that very first lineup probably has maybe at least one or maybe multiple of these receivers, right? We're not going to be able to see what order the lineups were made in. But it's going to basically recognize, hey, I have 0% exposure to a wide receiver that the player has set a minimum 80% exposure to. Use that player in the lineup, right? And then it goes on and uses the next player and uses the next player and uses the next player. So I think it is essentially going back to this question here. It's prioritizing meeting that min exposure regardless of how these players are projected first. And then it's getting to the end of its 500 and realizing I couldn't have met all of these exposures to everybody, and then sending you a message that says we can't meet it all, right? But its priority is clearly, rather than trying to give you 80% of the highest projected player overall, its number one priority is giving you an equal exposure to all of these individual players that you said you wanted 80% of. So I think that does a little bit at least confirm my suspicions of how it actually does that, which is more or less entirely agnostic to the player's projection, entirely independent. I feel like I'm saying agnostic too much. Entirely independent of the player's projection, and just we need to meet these exposures, so we are going to do it. Put another way, if let's say it's the builder is building its next lineup and it needs to make a decision of whether or not, I don't think it's making a decision of saying we need to use Justin Jefferson or Devontae Adams because a player has set a minimum exposure to both of these players, and then making a decision on which player is higher projected between those two. I imagine it is just entering one of them or both of them into the lineup and then building the best possible lineup around it. So, but I'll follow up with Matt too to get maybe a little bit more background on how that works, because now I'm curious. And if there is, this is another one too. If there is like a use case here that you've got in the back of your mind that you're willing to share, or a practical like follow up here of like, I'm trying to do this and running into troubles, or this is why I need to know this, let me know, because I might be able to help a little bit more with that. But that is at least how I understand what is going on here. So I am going to jump to this question here over to Cleansinger's question, and says, I just watched the Building High Upside NFL lineups video. FanDuel specific questions: when curating lineups, would you use the same 15 to 18.95th percentile cutoff? No, I wouldn't. So what this question is referring to is, in my most recent video, actually no longer most recent video, but my second most recent video I put out on our YouTube channel here. It's a video of me walking through my live process, building 150 lineups for, 3 videos ago now, sure enough, for the week 8, I think, NFL main slate, right? And one of the things I mentioned that I like to do is I do a little bit of player pool curation, where I will eliminate players that have under a certain raw scoring output of, I think in that video, I say somewhere between 15 to 18 DraftKings points at their 95th percentile outcome, right? I'm basically saying, if you don't have at least a 5% chance of scoring 15 points on the slate or more, I don't want you in my pool. It's a player pool curation thing I do. So no, on FanDuel, I would do it a little bit differently, because the point scoring is almost always different, right? FanDuel points are generally, or at least on a per player basis, are generally a little bit lower. I don't have like as great of a sense of where that line is drawn, because I play quite a bit more DraftKings than FanDuel. But on the slates that I do play both sites, typically what I end up doing is I will look at where I'm drawing that line on DraftKings, and then just look at who the last player is that gets cut off there, right? So just to draw that comparison. It's mostly because DraftKings has bonuses. That's why players score more on the DraftKings side. Uh-oh, what happened here? But I'll go look, and maybe the last player is, I don't know. It's normally some random guy, Josh Reynolds or something like that, right? I feel like I remember seeing that. So I'll do this. This is typically what I do. Is I'll go ahead and I'll look at the 95th percentile, and I look at the flex players, right? And I actually have changed the way I do this now, because we can do by position filters. So I have changed this a little bit, and now I've actually just been doing like include players where my projection is greater than like 5 to get me started. Gets me pretty close, right? You can kind of see. So let's say I wanted to cut it off at 15 raw points, right? So maybe it's about players that have, maybe it's 6, right? Maybe they have an average projection of about 6. I'll look at where that line's drawn. So in this case, it's Austin Hooper, right? And now we can go back over to FanDuel, and I'll kind of compare. And I'll look at this and see. So on FanDuel, Austin Hooper's only projected for 4.84, right? So on FanDuel, again, I mostly do this more as kind of an approximation. You don't get a lot of these players anyway, so I don't really care about being exact. You can't use decimals here, unfortunately, so I will typically just round up or down, and maybe on FanDuel, I'm doing 5. So I'm removing every player that's projected for 5 or less points. Just trimming some of the fat from the bottom of the pool. On NFL, big contests, right? Your variance is going to be really high. If some variance sometimes set here at 10, which means you can get those guys showing up in your lineups. And I just think it's just a little bit of a nice thing to trim off the bottom, preventing players that I don't want to be surprised by that happen to sneak into my lineups when lock comes by. So, but yeah, because FanDuel points on a per player basis are generally lower, an individual player generally scores less on FanDuel. Oh, also the PPR thing, right? FanDuel's half point PPR, DraftKings is full point PPR. It's good to just look and compare what's that last player that makes it into your pool on DraftKings, and then see what their projection is on FanDuel and make an adjustment there. So, Baron has a good question here about FanDuel single game slates. So Says FanDuel single game. In the builder, it appears that SaberSim ownership is cumulative for MVP and flex. For example, SaberSim's ownership projection, Lamar's SaberSim ownership projection is approximately 82%. Is there any way to set separate ownership projections for him in an MVP and flex, such as 80% MVP and 2% flex, or 70% MVP and 12% flex? This would apply to all players in a showdown slate. There, unfortunately, isn't at the moment with the way we're currently set up. It's kind of a problem with the data architecture here. The main reason why is that FanDuel uses the same player ID for a player, whether they are used in the MVP or the flex position, right? So the multiplier is just kind of applied on their end at the position, and Lamar Jackson has the same player ID either way, right? So it then gets kind of tricky to assign two different ownership projections to a player that has the same ID on our end, right? There's obviously kind of a way to do it on our end, but it's actually a surprisingly more complicated problem to figure out from a data standpoint on our end than it seems at first glance. So there's not really an easy way to do that right now. I would say this overall, because you don't pay more to roster a player at the MVP slot than the flex position, I think the ownership projections work pretty well applied across the board this way, right? In other words, I think it is likely that Lamar Jackson is the most owned player in the MVP position, right? And is probably double owned the next most highly owned player that at the moment we think is going to be Jacoby Brissett, right? On DraftKings, because you have to pay more to roster that player in the MVP slot, it can create differences in the way a lineup comes together, where a player that maybe the highest owned overall player on the slate is not necessarily the highest owned MVP, and so on, right? I don't think that's likely to happen on FanDuel because, again, you don't pay a different value to roster a player in the MVP slot. So I know it's a little frustrating right now, but I think the good news there, here's what I'm really trying to say. The good news there is that I think ownership fade as it is actually handles this still pretty well and uses players in the right spots accordingly. So let me put it one other way. If you were to take all of the ownership projections we have for each player and sum them all together and then standardize it to 100% projected ownership, I think those would actually work pretty well as MVP ownership projections, which means that the summed total ownership projections work just fine as it is. But we do want to eventually kind of be able to add support for proper MVP ownership projections here. It's just a bit of a pain on our end because of the way FanDuel chooses to handle this. So maybe FanDuel will update it on their end, but I doubt it. So cool. Let's see. Catching up on a few questions that came in through YouTube here. Crypto said, in response to my talking about lineup curation here, I feel like doing it in step 3 is sorting through overall better lineups than built with rules in step 1. Yeah, it really depends. And we even go back and forth on this a little bit internally here at SaberSim about where the best way to do it is. I do think there is a really strong argument to be made that if you have a sense of what you want to do with your lineups already, let's say you know that you don't want to play any Josh Allen, right? So the opposite, right? So you just uncheck him. You know that you don't want to. You're getting the opportunity to build 1,500 lineups with, or 500 or 1,500 lineups with that already taken into account. So I think there's an argument to be made that you're going to get a better pool. You're going to get a better set of lineups because rather than just taking the lineups that of your original pool that by chance don't happen to include Josh Allen, you are getting to build a much better pool of lineups that don't have him from the start. And I think that's a strong argument too. But I like to leave things alone, see what the best possible lineups are first, the 1,500 viable, and then select from there after. I think it's really a big kind of preference thing. So, and it also kind of comes, it's from like a Bayesian standpoint here. I think it also depends on how strong your priors are, right? Like if you have a very strong stance on the slate overall, I think it makes sense to do more of your work up front here. But I rarely do, right? Like I will willingly be persuaded 30 minutes before an NFL slate locks every single week if the builder is giving me something very different than what I was planning on doing. I'm totally fine with that. I have pretty weak priors for almost any slate that's coming up. So I almost always am happy to adjust and pivot purely because the builder says that something I was trying to do isn't possible within the first 1,500 lineups. But I know that's not the case for everybody. So depends, I think, on how strong your priors are. But Matt said on that note, Max mentioned in an NBA strategy video that a good way to maybe curate your player pool is by 95th percentile as well. What would be a good point target there? I think it depends a little bit on the slate, right? Like you could probably be a lot more intentional with player pool curation on a 13-game slate like last night than you can on a 3-game slate like tonight, right? Every player that you eliminate here, like we have a lot of players. Yeah, let's real quickly, for the sake of this, just change this to show all players that have a projection. Right. So, I mean, we're going to, every player you remove from your pool on a 3-game slate is going to be a lot more impactful. And like that player probably has a much higher chance of being in the winning lineup than an equivalently projected player on a 13-game slate, right? Higher variance with just these 3 games. So I think it's a little bit slate dependent. I think one thing that I'll kind of tell you what I've been thinking about. Here's one way I've been doing this, or at least exploring this season, is I've really been liking for NBA in particular, because average projections are just so important and pretty predictive and of what a player is likely to do, right? They're normally distributed. A lot of a large percentage of a player's outcomes are centered around that mean outcome, right? Is I've really been liking running, even if I'm not playing cash, I've really been liking running a cash build and getting an idea of what the average projection is, right? What's the highest projected optimal lineup you can build? So let's go ahead and like quickly, it doesn't even matter, whatever. Let's just say that, and then sort by projected score here, which typically doesn't change anything. Okay, so you can build at best a lineup with 284.7 projected points, right? And this salary is 50K, right? So you basically need, for a cash lineup, 284.7 divided by 50K, right? So you need like every dollar you're spending to optimize purely for projected points to get you roughly 5.7 fantasy points of value, right? So then what I like to do here is I've been looking kind of at the min salary, right? So min salary on DraftKings is always 3K. So 5.7 times 3K is 17 fantasy points overall, right? So like a 3K player to fit into a cash lineup, right? Players have way more lineup, right? Or way more upside than that. But to fit into a cash lineup, a minimum price player needs to score 17.1 points for this particular slate. So I've kind of been using that as a tool of a guideline of my player pool curation, of then saying, okay, I want a player that at least has a 5% chance to have that outcome, right? My player pool curation is going to be at least players that have a chance to have that outcome. And you can see in a 3-game slate, that actually is going to widen your player pool a bit based than the defaults would. And this is an approach that I'm taking here that is, I think, fairly non-restrictive, I guess, right? Like you're leaving a lot of players in the pool. You could have a more upside focused, or you could have an approach here that was more limiting on your player pool, right? You could say I want a 15% chance of any player to have that outcome, right? And that would trim off a little bit more, or a 25% chance of having that outcome, depending on how like restrictive you want it to be here of limiting your player pool. But that's kind of just been something I've been experimenting with a little bit of like that allows some slate context to come in. Because the problem here is that if you're just going to say, I'm always going to remove the same players from the pool, right? I'm always going to set the same limitations on my player pool. The problem is it doesn't take into account slate nuance. So we're fortunate that this slate actually does have some solid value for a 3-game slate, but if it didn't, you probably would need to incorporate more players into your pool. And that approach would allow you to do that. Whereas when there's a ton of value on the slate, right, you want to be a little bit more restrictive of what players you allow into your pool. So Matt said, would you still employ something like this on a big slate, such as the case last night? Yeah, I think I would. But last night, the optimal lineup that you could build pre-lock was like almost 300 points, I think. I don't even know. I can't remember now. But you could pack a lot more projected points into a single cash game lineup, which means that it is easier to build good lineups, which means I want to strip more players off the bottom of my pool, these kind of bottom feeder type players, so that they don't accidentally end up taking a lineup spot up, and the opportunity cost of that lineup spot is really high. The opportunity cost of the lineup is really high when you can pack more projected points into your lineup. So the process that I'm using to get there and actually make that calculation is, I think, kind of arbitrary. It just is something that kind of works for me. But I think thinking about it that way, the broader point is thinking about it that way, I think, is the right way, right? The more viable, the more great value plays are, the more projected points you can pack into an optimal lineup, I think the more you would want to justify removing very low projected plays from your pool. And this is always going to be 15 by default for every slate. So, I mean, I think you could even take a much more simpler approach, and without even really doing too much research yourself, just say like things like, tonight's a 3-game slate. I don't want to be this limited on my player pool. I'm going to bring this down to 12, and I'm going to allow some lower projected plays into my pool, right? Maybe even lower than that, maybe 10. But on a 13-game slate like last night, maybe it's 21. I'm kind of using multiples of 3 here, but I think it's good. I think it's a good thought. I think it's a strong process of thinking about player pool curation that way. But definitely on a 3-game slate tonight, it does make some sense to open up your player pool a little bit more to capture plays that could sneak in, right? So Phil said 0. Yeah, maybe, right? You're not going to get a ton of those guys anyway. And if you do, let's say you're playing, especially if you're playing like large field stuff too. That's the other thing, is like let it be, let your contest help dictate this as well. If you're telling me you're playing single entry 500 person contest tonight, you probably don't need some of those low projected plays in your lineups. And maybe the sliders will just take care of that for you, right? But if you're playing the large field stuff, right, sim variance is going to be 10. So what's nice about that is even if you get any of these low projected plays showing up in your lineup, it means that there's a simulation, a single game simulation, or a single slate simulation where it makes sense to roster that player, right? Because sim variance 10 is using single game simulations to determine the projections for each player when we build each lineup. I say that once a stream. Most important concept of SaberSim to grasp is how the sim variance slider works. So what is nice about that is that if you are even rostering a low projected player, right? Let's see, do we have any? Let's see. So you're seeing we're not getting anybody below Torrey Craig here. But we do have a Torrey Craig lineup who this lineup wouldn't have been possible with our default min projection filters. And there's a slate simulation or a game simulation where it makes sense to roster Torrey Craig, right? He's not just showing up here because his average point per dollar is really good, or because that just worked to fit the rest of the lineup. It's because in this individual sim, right? Or not sim, this individual slate sim, or this individual combination of game sims that created this lineup, it made sense to play Torrey Craig. So the simulations themselves can save you at times from making a bad decision. I was looking here at just in our entire pool, right? We actually have a couple Justice Winslow lineups. So very bottom of the pool, relatively low Saber score, but still showing up there. Game simulation where it made sense to do that. So yeah, I wouldn't talk you out of 0 on a 3-game slate. But yeah, good questions. KC said, what salary parameters would you recommend for an NFL DFS GPP greater than 50K 150 entry contest? DK and FanDuel, does salary make a huge difference? I just roll with the defaults. I don't really worry about it too much. You're realistically with a normal ownership fade level and the typical variance that you're going to be having on a contest like this, you have virtually no chance of being duplicated. Like, you could be potentially duplicated in a big NFL GPP for a main slate if you were playing like a cash optimal or something like that, potentially. But with the variance settings you're going to have and the ownership fade settings that you're going to have by default here, your chance of being duplicated is virtually 0. So I'm not really concerned with editing max salary. I do think there's an interesting case to be made for lowering min salary, especially on the right slate. So I think 49.5 is totally fine, right? A lot of your lineups are going to be made above that anyway, because there's so many different players on a given slate. It's very easy to use all of the salary, right? NFL players are still relatively well correlated. Their actual points are relatively well correlated to their salaries. Players that cost more generally score more. In a sport like baseball, this is a lot lower because, especially for baseball hitters, for example, actual point production is not as well correlated to salary. So it makes sense for this to be lower, but in NFL, it is. So this is set at 49.5 to just build lineups that are at high salary ranges. I think there's a couple things. First of all, one thing I like to do here is on particular slates where there is like insane value that has opened up. Like if there is a player that is projecting, this is actually getting there, right? This is really high. There are slates where guys can reach 5x value at times. But even talking about a guy that's 4x value, a lot of times I will think about removing this, or not removing it, but maybe moving it down a little bit. Last week's slate was perfect, a perfect example of this, because we had multiple starting QBs that were really low priced. So we had guys like Jordan Love and Colt McCoy starting at like 4 or 4.5K. And I didn't want the builder to build me lineups that were less correlated because it was trying to meet a min salary requirement, right? Like if what made sense for that particular lineup was to play, I don't know. Okay, the Colt McCoy example is really good because DeAndre Hopkins was out too. So I wouldn't want a lineup to use Colt McCoy and then not use Rondale Moore or Christian Kirk, who are also low salary, even though those were players that had very high correlations to McCoy, purely because of a salary requirement that was put on the builder. So I will pay attention to that a little bit sometimes. Keeping an eye out. If there's a lot of really good value plays on a slate, I will sometimes lower this to like 4,900, just so it's not just so I'm not unnecessarily restricting the builder from a min salary standpoint. Another interesting experiment, now that we can do it, that I've liked doing is building this here. And we don't need 1,500 lineups. We'll just build 500. But setting this at 0. And I think it's kind of fun to run this build and then go look and see what the lowest salary builds are in your pool. And you can do this now. So we'll let this build for a second. I'll show you how to do this. But it is an interesting experiment to see, with that min salary requirement stripped away, what is the lowest salary build you could build that SaberSim feels is within the first 500 or 1,500 optimal lineups for a slate. This can also be an interesting tool of maybe where to set that, right? So you can look at this. Well, I'll tell you in a second once we get this all up. While this is building, the one thing I will say is you don't need to sweat about this. This is not something that I would be freaking out about on a Sunday morning trying to figure out where to set your min salary or max salary. The defaults are perfectly fine. This is mostly just something that I think is kind of interesting to take a look at and dive a little bit deeper into. But the default values are going to do exactly what you need them to do. But you can go ahead and set this to salary here, and we can look and see what is our lowest salary lineup that shows up when no salary requirements, no min salary is set. So there's this lineup here, 45-8, right? Throws in a bunch of really kind of low salary, maybe underpriced plays. What's interesting is this actually is 45-8 without including the best value play on the entire slate of Dearness Johnson, right? So you can see we're getting lineups that are as low as 4,600 down here in our first 500. So, and then what I like to do is get an idea of what these lineups are projected for. So 122, right? What's our best projected score lineup overall? 150, right? So one thing that would stand out to me is if there were lineups that were showing up in the pool that were very low salary that had a similar projected score, that might be an indication to me that it's a good week to turn down that min salary slider. But in this case, we're getting some lineups here that are really low salary that are also really low projected score. So I don't think it's that kind of week. And I'll probably leave this. I will probably leave this around 49,000 for this particular week for me. I do think 49.5 can sometimes be a little restrictive, especially when there's good value plays on the slate. So I'll probably bring it down to 49,000. But I don't think I'll go any lower than that. So, but again, spent a lot of time talking about that question, just mostly because it was on my mind last week with a strange week with having multiple QBs and a lot of players out and a lot of value opening up. Average week, not something you need to sweat at all. And I would say the defaults are going to take good care of you. So. MC Hammer says, when will SaberSim include SuperDraft? We are working on it. It is in progress on our end, getting that set up. I don't have an estimated date, unfortunately, at the moment, but it is in progress, that integration on our end. So, but on the Yahoo side, we are also very close on entry editor support for Yahoo. I mentioned that because that is essentially in front of the SuperDraft integration, is just getting that entry editor support for Yahoo. So that's coming. If you play Yahoo, that's very close. So, but anyway, we are right at about the hour mark here today. So we'll go ahead. We'll cut the stream off right there. Thank you to everybody that asked questions today. Some interesting questions. Some definitely some more. I don't know what the right word is. Specific questions about the way that we do certain things, the correlation, the ownership fade slider, handling min and max exposures pre-build. We got to run some experiments today, which was kind of fun. So always excited to get some fresh questions, some new questions in here. So thanks to everybody that participated, contributed, asked questions. Thank you to everybody here that watches this show after it is up as a recording. I know there are a bunch of you out there listening to this on your way home from work, on your commute home. So appreciate all you guys. We'll be right back here again tomorrow, Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So tune in again. And until then, good luck. See ya.